She inherited half a bookstore with a stranger. Rain. Cold, sideways rain hammering against glass, and inside, string lights swinging from a ceiling that hadn't seen a paintbrush in 10 years. 40 people crammed into a bookstore that, 6 hours earlier, hadn't had a single customer in months. Emma Ross stood in the middle of it all, holding a glass of champagne she hadn't touched, watching strangers fall in love with the place she'd fallen in love with first. That's when the door slammed open. A man in a grey suit, soaked to the bone, stood in the doorway with an envelope raised over his head like a weapon. Emma Ross. Jake Bennett. This store is being seized, effective immediately. The room went silent. Every face turned. Emma's champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. Jake stepped in front of her before she could speak, his jaw tight, his voice low and lethal. You don't get to do this. Not tonight. Watch me, the man said, and dropped the envelope onto the nearest table like it was nothing. Like 6 months of their lives were nothing. Emma's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall in front of 40 strangers. She looked at Jake. He looked back at her, and for the first time since they'd met, he looked scared too. Neither of them knew, standing there in the wreckage of a party that was supposed to be a celebration, that everything that had brought them to this exact moment had started with a letter neither of them wanted to open. 6 months earlier. Emma Ross had exactly $4 in her checking account, and a shift at the flower shop starting in 20 minutes when the letter arrived. Cream-colored envelope, heavy paper, a law firm's return address she didn't recognize. She almost threw it out with the coupons. She didn't. And that single decision would change the rest of her life. The letter said her presence was required at the office of Coleman and Associates regarding the estate of one Arthur Whitfield. Emma stood in her cramped kitchen holding the paper like it might be a mistake, a prank, someone else's mail delivered to the wrong address. She hadn't thought about Arthur Whitfield in 15 years. Not really. Just flashes, sometimes, when she smelled old paper or heard a certain kind of quiet. The bookstore on Maple Street where she used to hide after school, when home was loud in ways an 8-year-old shouldn't have to survive. Mr. Whitfield never asked questions. He just handed her a book and a chair by the window and let her disappear into it for as long as she needed. She remembered one afternoon specifically, the kind of memory that stays sharp when everything around it has gone soft. She'd been 9, soaked from walking home in the rain rather than sit in a house where her parents were screaming at each other again, and she ducked into the first open door on Maple Street without thinking. Arthur Whitfield hadn't asked why a soaking, shaking child had wandered into his shop alone. He'd simply set a towel on the counter, made her a cup of watered-down cocoa from a hot plate in the back, and pointed at the window seat. That one's the best in the house, he'd said. Nobody will bother you there. She'd read there until her mother finally called looking for her, and she went back nearly every week after that for years, never once made to feel like a burden. She hadn't seen him in a decade. And now, apparently, he was gone. And somehow, impossibly, he had left her something. Across town, in a glass office 40 floors up, Jake Bennett was staring at an identical envelope, except his hands weren't shaking the way Emma's were. Jake didn't let his hands shake. Not anymore. Not since he'd made partner track at Halloway and Kest by turning every soft edge of himself into something sharper, something billable. He read the letter twice. Arthur Whitfield. The name landed somewhere he'd spent years trying to seal shut. He'd been 16, angry at everything, when a judge had sentenced him to community service hours at a bookstore instead of somewhere worse. Arthur Whitfield hadn't lectured him. Hadn't called his mother. He'd just put him to work reshelving mystery novels and, somewhere in those months, without either of them noticing it happening, had taught him that not every authority figure was waiting to fail him. He remembered the first day of that community service sentence clearly, mostly because of how little Arthur had actually said. No lecture about second chances, no speech about turning his life around. Just a box of returns and an instruction to alphabetize them by author. Jake had expected to be watched, tested, catalogued like every other adult in his life at the time. Instead, Arthur left him alone with the books for 3 hours and, when he came back to check, simply nodded at the shelf and said, "You've got a good eye for order." Most people don't. It was such a small thing to say. Jake had thought about it, on and off, for the better part of a decade, without ever quite admitting that to himself. Jake hadn't spoken to the old man in almost 12 years. He told himself he didn't have time for whatever this was. He cancelled 2 meetings and went anyway. The law office smelled like old coffee and older carpet. Emma was already in the waiting room when Jake walked in, and they clocked each other the way strangers do, A quick assessment, nothing more. She was in a paint-stained cardigan. He was in a suit that cost more than her monthly rent. Neither of them said a word until Mr. Coleman opened his office door and called them both in together. "Both of you," Emma said. At the same time. Coleman, a round, patient man who looked like he'd been doing this exact job since before either of them was born, gestured them into 2 chairs. Arthur Whitfield left specific instructions. "You're both here for the same reason." He slid a folder across the desk. Emma opened it with fingers that had gone cold. Arthur Whitfield had left them the bookstore. The last chapter, on Maple Street, the same shop where Emma had hidden from a loud house and where Jake had learned to stop expecting the worst from people. He'd left it to both of them. Equally. 50-50. "There's a condition," Coleman said, and something in his tone made Emma's stomach drop. "You have to run it together. Both of you, actively, for 1 full year, before either of you can sell your share or buy the other out. If either of you walks away before the year is up, your entire share reverts to the estate and goes to Mr. Whitfield's next of kin." "Next of kin?" Jake asked. The door behind them opened without a knock. A man in his 40s walked in, dressed sharp, a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "That would be me," he said. "Derek Whitfield. Arthur was my uncle, and I intend to see this ridiculous will contested within the month." He looked at Emma, then at Jake, with the practiced dismissal of a man used to getting his way. "No offense to either of you, but a florist and a lawyer running a dying bookstore isn't a plan, it's a fantasy. That building is worth $800,000 as commercial real estate. My uncle wasn't in his right mind when he wrote this, and I have every intention of proving it." "He seemed like he knew exactly what he was doing to me," Emma said quietly. Derek's smile didn't move. "We'll see." Emma looked at this stranger threatening the only piece of her childhood that had ever felt safe, and something in her, something that had been quiet and small for a very long time, decided she wasn't giving it up without a fight. She looked at Jake. He was already looking back at her, jaw set, and for the first time, something like an alliance passed between 2 people who, 20 minutes earlier, hadn't known the other existed. "We'll do it," Emma said, before Jake could even respond. He raised an eyebrow. "We will." "You have a problem with that, Mr. Bennett." Jake looked at Derek's smug, entitled face, thought about every version of himself he'd built to survive rooms exactly like this one, and said, "No. No problem at all." The last chapter had been closed for 8 months. Dust sat thick on every shelf. A dead ficus slumped in the corner window. The register drawer was stuck shut, and when Emma finally pried it open, she found a single faded photograph of Arthur, decades younger, standing outside the store with his arm around a woman Emma didn't recognize. "Who's that?" Jake asked, looking over her shoulder. "I have no idea," Emma said, "but I want to find out." They didn't like each other, at first. Not really. Emma wanted to repaint every wall a warm color and host poetry nights and put a reading nook by the window exactly where hers used to be. Jake wanted spreadsheets, inventory systems, a 5-year plan before either of them touched a paintbrush. You can't run a business on vibes, Emma. You can't run a bookstore like it's a hedge fund, Jake. They fought about the paint color. They fought about the hours. They fought, loudly, about whether the store even needed a cat. Jake citing 3 separate liability concerns and 1 allergy he didn't actually have, Emma pointing out that every good bookstore in every good story had one, until a stray orange tabby wandered in through a prop door during one of those very arguments, walked directly past both of them, and curled up in the one patch of sunlight on the floor like he'd been paying rent there for years. Jake opened his mouth to object. The cat looked at him, unbothered, and Jake closed his mouth again. "He's staying," Emma said. "I didn't say anything." "You were going to." "I was going to ask what we are naming him." Emma grinned for the first time since they'd met. "Chapter 2, she said. "Obviously." But somewhere between the fighting, things started shifting. Jake found the photograph again one night while auditing old receipts, and instead of setting it aside, he sat with it for a long time. Emma caught him staring at it and, for once, didn't tease him. "He never talked about a wife," she said. "I didn't even know he'd been married." "Maybe he wasn't," Jake said quietly. "Maybe that's the point." They started finding more. Notes tucked into the margins of second-hand books. A ledger hidden behind a false panel in the back office, filled with Arthur's handwriting. Not accounting, but something closer to a diary. Entries about a woman named Claire. about a version of his life he never got to have. Emma read one entry out loud, her voice catching halfway through. I told myself there would be time. There is never as much time as you think there is. If I could tell her one thing now, it would be that I stopped being afraid too late to matter. It was Mrs. Ferris, weeks later, who finally gave the story a face. She'd known Arthur since they were both young, she said, and she remembered Claire well, a violinist who used to play at the county fair every summer, who Arthur had loved quietly and completely for almost 2 years before he let his own fear of change talk him out of following her when she left for a position with an orchestra out west. He wrote to her for a while, Mrs. Ferris said, setting a chipped teacup down like the memory itself was fragile. Then one day he just stopped. Told me once he was afraid if he kept writing, he'd have to admit how much he regretted letting her go, and he wasn't ready to feel that yet. By the time he was ready, he told himself it was too late, and I think some small part of him decided it always would be. Emma looked at Jake across the room after that story, and neither of them needed to say out loud what they were both thinking. Neither of them said anything for a while after that. Getting the store ready wasn't something they managed alone, even if neither of them had expected help to show up the way it did. A retired contractor named Mr. Doyle, who'd apparently owed Arthur a favor from decades back that he refused to explain, showed up one Saturday with a truck full of lumber and simply started fixing the sagging front steps without being asked. 2 of Emma's old co-workers from the flower shop spent an afternoon repainting the trim a deep, warm green that Jake privately admitted looked better than anything in his original spreadsheet of approved colors. By the end of that week, the dead ficus had been replaced, the register drawer glided open on its own, and the window seat, Emma's window seat, had a new cushion in faded yellow, sewn by Mrs. Ferris, who said it was the least she could do for the man who'd let her read every gardening book in the store for free during a hard winter 30 years earlier. The town started noticing them. Old Mrs. Ferris, who'd shopped at the last chapter since it opened 40 years ago, came in on their first official reopening week and cried when she saw the shelves full again. A group of teenagers started using the back corner as a study spot every Thursday. Emma organized a book club before she'd even fully thought it through, and 11 people showed up to the first meeting, packed into folding chairs, arguing passionately about a novel none of them had finished. Somebody's toddler kept trying to eat the discussion questions Emma had printed out. A retired schoolteacher named Howard nearly came to blows, entirely good-naturedly, with a college student over whether the ending of the book was hopeful or devastating, and the 2 of them ended up exchanging phone numbers to keep arguing about it later. Jake stood near the register the whole time, ostensibly restocking a shelf that didn't need restocking, and Emma caught him smiling at the chaos more than once when he thought no one was looking. "You could join in, you know," she told him afterward, sweeping up abandoned cookie crumbs. "Nobody's going to bite." "Next time," he said. And, to her genuine surprise, he actually meant it. The days took on a rhythm neither of them had expected to enjoy as much as they did. Mornings meant Emma arriving first to open the blinds and put on a pot of coffee too strong for anyone but her, Jake arriving 20 minutes later with 2 cups anyway because he'd learned, without being told, exactly how she took hers. Afternoons brought the same rotating cast of regulars, retirees browsing large print mysteries, a rotating cast of remote workers claiming the 2 good tables by the outlet, kids doing homework in the back after school let out. By early evening, Emma would be elbow deep in returns while Jake balanced the register, and more nights than either of them admitted out loud, they'd end up closing later than necessary simply because neither wanted to be the one to say it was time to go home. Jake, to his own visible surprise, was good with the regulars. He remembered what people had bought last time. He recommended books with a precision that made Emma raise an eyebrow at him more than once. "You read all of these?" she asked one night, gesturing at the towering shelf of literary fiction he'd somehow catalogued from memory. "I used to," he said. "Before I convinced myself I didn't have time for things that didn't bill by the hour. And now—" He didn't answer right away. "Now I remember why I liked it." Derek didn't disappear. He came back twice in the first 2 months, each time with a new legal angle, each time meeting the same wall of 2 people who, despite everything, had started standing shoulder to shoulder against him without discussing it. He caught her alone one afternoon while Jake was at the bank, leaning against her car in the small lot behind the store like he'd been waiting a while. $200,000, he said, no preamble. For your half. Cash, quiet, no lawyers involved but mine. You could pay off whatever you owe, get a real apartment, stop scraping by on a florist's wage. Jake will take a settlement of his own eventually. Men like him always do the math and land on money. Might as well be the one who gets there first. You don't know anything about him, Emma said. I know he billed 300 hours a month for a decade before this. That tells me plenty. It tells you what he used to be, Emma said, and got in her car without another word. He tried offering to buy Emma out privately, quietly, behind Jake's back, for enough money to change her life. She said no without hesitating, and told Jake about it that same night. You could have taken it, Jake said. It's a lot of money, Emma. I know, she said. It's not about the money for me. Is it about the money for you? He looked at her for a long moment. It never was. One Sunday afternoon, a man came in alone, moving slowly, and asked Emma to help him find a particular novel his wife had loved 30 years ago and could no longer remember the title of. He explained, quietly, that she was in the late stages of an illness that was taking her memories one at a time, and that reading her favorite books aloud was one of the last things that still reliably brought her back to herself. Emma spent 40 minutes with him, pulling books off shelves, reading first lines aloud, until his face finally broke open with recognition at one particular sentence. He bought it, thanked her twice, and left. Emma didn't say anything for a long time after the bell over the door stopped ringing. Jake, watching from the register, didn't ask her to explain. He just came and stood next to her at the window, close enough that their shoulders touched, until she was ready to talk again. This is why the spreadsheet isn't the point, she said eventually. Not the only point, anyway. Jake almost smiled. I know, he said. I think I've known for a while. Derek's next move was quieter, and meaner for it. Their main book distributor called to say a large, unnamed account had raised concerns about the store's financial stability, and unless they paid the next 3 months upfront in full, deliveries would stop. It didn't take long to trace the call back to a shell company with Derek's fingerprints all over it. Emma wanted to march to his office and scream. Jake, instead, spent a night drafting a letter citing 3 separate statutes about tortious interference with business relationships, and hand-delivered it himself the next morning. The deliveries resumed within 48 hours, and Derek didn't try that particular trick again, though it was clear, watching him watch them from across the street a few days later, that he wasn't finished. Somewhere in the 3rd month, closing the store together on a slow Tuesday, rain sliding down the front windows exactly like the night this whole thing had started, Jake reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind Emma's ear without quite meaning to. They both froze. Sorry, he said. Don't be, she said, and neither of them moved for a long moment after that. They didn't talk about what it meant. Not yet. There was too much else in motion, a store to save, a will to defend, a cousin circling with lawyers of his own. But something had shifted, quiet and undeniable, and they both knew it. There were good nights too, plenty of them. Jake taught Emma how to actually read a balance sheet without her eyes glazing over, bribing her through it with the promise of takeout from the Thai place she liked. Emma, in turn, dragged Jake to the county fair he hadn't been to since he was a teenager, and stood laughing until she couldn't breathe when he won her an absurdly oversized stuffed rabbit at the ring toss booth he'd insisted, with total seriousness, that he could solve like a spreadsheet. He carried that rabbit back to the store under one arm, refusing to admit he was pleased with himself, and it sat propped in the window seat from that night on. Then came the argument that nearly ended everything. It started with a lunch. His old colleague Priyanka, one of the few people at Halloway and Kest he still respected, met him for coffee and spent 45 minutes describing everything waiting for him back at the firm: a corner office, a client list he'd spent years cultivating, a version of success that used to be the only kind he could picture for himself. Nobody thinks less of you for trying something different for a while, she said. But a bookstore in a town of 4,000 people isn't a career, Jake. It's a sabbatical. Eventually, you have to go back to a real life. He didn't argue with her. He wasn't sure, driving back to Maple Street afterward, that he entirely disagreed. 3 days later, his old firm called. A partner position, real money, the life he'd spent a decade building before any of this. He didn't tell Emma for 3 days, and when she found out, from Mrs. Ferris, of all people, who'd overheard him on the phone, she felt something in her chest crack in a way she hadn't expected. You were going to just leave, she said, without even telling me. I hadn't decided anything. You hadn't decided to tell me, either. It's my life, Emma. I have a right to think about it before I. You have a right to think about it. You don't have a right to let me build a future in a place you might just walk away from without a word. That's not fair, Emma. This partnership is everything I train for. You don't know what it's like to finally be offered the thing you spent 10 years chasing. You're right, I don't, she snapped back. I know what it's like to watch someone build something with you and then find out, secondhand, from a woman who does our windows, that is already halfway out the door. Forgive me for not seeing the difference. It's not halfway out the door. I said I hadn't decided. You've been not deciding for 3 days, Jake. That's its own kind of decision. He didn't have an answer for that. She left the store early that night for the first time in months, and the silence between them the next morning was worse than any of their arguments had ever been. It was Mr. Coleman, of all people, who found Jake sitting alone in his car outside the shop 2 days later and handed him one more item from Arthur's estate, a sealed letter, addressed to whichever of the two heirs needed it most. Arthur had apparently instructed, with strict orders it only be opened if things nearly fell apart. Jake opened it in the car. Arthur's handwriting again, shakier than in the ledger, clearly written near the end. It said that he had spent 30 years running from the version of his life that included Claire, telling himself there would be time to go back for it, until there wasn't. It said that he'd watched Jake, all those years ago, build walls faster than any 16-year-old should know how to build them, and had hoped that someday, something would matter enough to make him tear one down before it was too late. It said the same about Emma, in different words, that he'd watched a lonely kid disappear into books because the real world hadn't given her anywhere safe to stand, and hoped that someday she'd let someone stand there with her. The letter ended, I am not asking you to save my store. I am asking you not to make my mistake. Jake sat in that car for a long time. Then he went inside. Emma was locking up alone, the cat weaving around her ankles, when the bell over the door rang behind her. We are closed, she said, without turning around. I know, Jake said. I'm not here about the store. She turned. He looked wrecked in a way she'd never seen him look, not the polished, composed Jake who negotiated with contractors and outmaneuvered Derek's lawyers, but something raw underneath all of that. I turned it down, he said. The partnership. Hours ago. Jake. I should have told you the second the call came in. I didn't, because some old habit in me still thinks the safest thing is to decide everything alone before anyone else can leave first. That's not fair to you. It was never about the money, Emma. It was never even really about the store, not anymore. He took a breath. It's about you. It's been about you for months, and I was too much of a coward to say it out loud. I don't want the version of you that decides everything alone in a car outside a building, Jake. I want the version that tells me when it's hard, even if the answer scares you. That version's harder to be, he admitted. I'm out of practice. So get some practice, she said, softer now. Starting tonight. He nodded, once, like he was signing something binding. Starting tonight. Emma didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she crossed the space between them and kissed him before either of them could talk it into something more complicated than it was. They had exactly 11 days of something close to peace before Derek made his final move. Mr. Coleman called them into his office one more time before it all came to a head, looking more tired than either of them had seen him. Derek's lawyers filed for an emergency hearing, he said. I won't sugarcoat it. The zoning argument they've dug up is a real gap in the paperwork, not just noise. If the town board sides with him, there won't be an appeal fast enough to save the property from going to auction. He looked at Jake specifically. You know how these hearings go better than I do at this point. It's yours to lose. He'd found a technicality, a clause about the original zoning permit, decades out of date, that he claimed invalidated the entire will. He called for a public hearing at the town hall, dragging the whole community into it, certain that a room full of strangers would side with money and paperwork over two people who'd been running the place for half a year. He was wrong. The night of the hearing, half the town showed up. Mrs. Ferris spoke first, her voice shaking with anger on their behalf, describing 40 years of a store that had never turned away a lonely kid looking for somewhere quiet to sit. The Thursday study group showed up in force, one of them, a shy 17-year-old named Priya, standing up to say the store's back corner was the only place she'd ever felt like she could breathe during her parents' divorce. The book club brought a petition with 200 signatures collected in 4 days. Even Mr. Doyle, who'd never said more than 10 words to either of them at once, stood up just long enough to say, I fixed those steps for Arthur's memory. I'll fix them again for these two, long as they need me to, and sat back down before anyone could respond. And then Jake stood up, still every inch the lawyer he'd trained a decade to become, and dismantled Derek's zoning argument clause by clause, citing precedent Derek's own lawyer hadn't bothered to check, until Derek's case wasn't just weak, it was embarrassing. But it was Emma's words that the town remembered longest. She stood up last, hands shaking, and talked about being 8 years old in a house that was too loud, and finding one quiet corner of the world that let her breathe. She talked about a man who never asked her to explain herself, who just handed her a book and let her stay as long as she needed. "This store isn't a business decision," she said, looking directly at Derek. "It's a promise, and we intend to keep it." The room erupted into applause. Derek, outmaneuvered and out of arguments, walked out before the vote was even called. 6 months to the day after they'd first walked into Coleman's office as strangers, Emma and Jake stood in the last chapter, freshly repainted, string lights back up from the night of the failed seizure, the whole town packed in to celebrate a store that had, against every possible odd, survived. Jake found her by the window seat, the same window Emma used to hide in as a girl, and pulled a small book from his jacket pocket, the very first one Arthur had ever handed her, all those years ago, which she'd thought she'd lost for good. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her eyes already filling. "Behind the false panel," Jake said. "He kept it. I think he always knew you'd come back for it." Emma opened the front cover. Inside, in Arthur's careful handwriting, a note she'd never seen before, "For whoever needs this seat by the window next. May you find someone to sit beside you in it." She looked up at Jake. He was already looking at her the way he had that first rainy night, except now there was nothing scared in it at all. 1 year later, the last chapter was the busiest bookstore in 3 counties. The window seat had a small brass plaque now, dedicated to Arthur Whitfield, and, underneath, a second line that simply read, "And everyone who ever needed a quiet place to land." Mr. Doyle still stopped by every few weeks to check on those front steps, whether they needed it or not. Priya ran the Thursday study group herself now, the way Emma once had, complete with her own opinions about which corner had the best light. Mrs. Ferris had a standing chair by the register, holding court most Saturday mornings, and the orange tabby cat had long since claimed the window seat as often as any customer did, curling up beside the small brass plaque like he'd always known it was his to guard. Emma and Jake ran the store together, argued about paint colors and inventory systems exactly as much as they ever had, and neither of them would have changed a single day of how it started, with a letter neither of them wanted to open, from a man neither of them had said goodbye to in time, who had spent 30 years learning the one lesson he made sure, in the end, that they never had to learn the hard way. Arthur Whitfield never got to meet the 2 people he'd chosen for that window seat. Not really. Not as the people they became after 6 months of paint fumes and property disputes and slow Tuesday nights spent closing up together. But Emma liked to think he knew, somehow, exactly what he was doing when he wrote both their names onto the same piece of paper. Not because he was matchmaking from beyond the grave, though the town certainly liked to say so, but because he recognized, in both of them, the exact same kind of quiet, stubborn loneliness he'd spent 30 years running from himself, and he'd wanted, more than anything, for at least one more story to end differently than his had. Some inheritances aren't about what you're given. They're about who you become while you're figuring out what to do with it.